Hello and welcome. I call the channel the Jungle Nook, and today I'd like to talk about root rot. And we will get into identification and treatment of root rot, as well as how we can prepare our potting mixes to not only reduce the likelihood of our plants experiencing this, but also how to prepare it in such a way so that the root's in the best possible position to be able to fight this off all on its own. So first, I'd just like to talk about what it actually is, which is a pathogen, which is a type of bacteria or fungus, which will actually get into the root structure and infect the root and begin killing it. Now, all soil has bacteria and fungus in it. It's everywhere in every habitat and every environment, including in the pots in our homes. It's vital. We really need it. And not all bacteria and fungus are actually pathogens which can harm our plants. What bacteria and fungus do is they're the decomposers that break down all the dead organic material by consuming it and breaking it down into smaller pieces or other compounds which the roots are able to absorb, and that's how they get the nutrients, by these bacterias and funguses decomposing the material, creating a compost in the soil. But the problem is some of these bacterias and funguses, which are classified as pathogens, they do two things. The first thing, when these pathogens come in contact with a healthy plant cell, they start to reproduce really fast. And at the same time, this is where the infection comes in. They actually will infect that healthy part of the root that they've come in contact with and start killing it, so that will become the new food source for that greater colony of pathogens, which are multiplying exponentially right at that spot. And it starts working its way right up the root and can even get into the stem and kill the plant. So, like I said, bacteria and fungus are everywhere, including our pots, and they're necessary. So there's no real reason to be concerned whether or not they're in there, because they are. But the nice thing is, the pathogens, the ones that can harm the plant, they actually need a slightly different environment to be able to thrive in, as opposed to the beneficial bacteria and organisms that are in the soil. Pathogens require wet soil, because the wetter the soil is, the less oxygen there is, and they survive the best in a low oxygen soil. The roots, which require, moisture and a food source, as well as oxygen. That's the big one, the oxygen. We're all taught and we've all heard that overwatering causes root rot. But actually, when you overwater, you're reducing the amount of oxygen in the soil. And when you have saturated soil and the oxygen level drops, and this happens for a prolonged time, the roots will actually die. And that's where the bacteria starts to feed and is eventually going to come up to a part of the healthy root. And that's when the whole cycle starts. So this is why drainage is so important in your pots, so that the plants do not sit in saturated, waterlogged soil. The soil itself has to be able to drain pretty quick, and to be able to be composed of materials that are able to allow a good amount of oxidation in the soil, for not only the roots to stay healthy and strong, but also to make sure that those healthy bacteria are present in the soil. Plants have evolved right alongside of bacteria and funguses and all sorts of pests, but they've developed their own strategies and methods to be able to defend themselves. Now, when talking about these pathogens, the first line of defense that the plant has control over is the the skin or the outer layer on the root, the outermost layer. It is developed in such a way to prevent infections, to prevent the bacterias and funguses from even being able to get into the root. They can be on the root, but they can't get in it. But if they do find a way in, the second line of defense is the plant's immune system. And if it's a healthy plant to start with a strong immune system, and it happens to get an infection, but the soil is well draining and well aerated, then the plant will most likely be able to fight this off all on its own. Most likely, you may have already experienced this in your house and never even known it because your plants were healthy enough to be able to fight the infection off on its own. So that's why you'll hear overwatering as a cause for root rot, and it actually is. But also underwatering can also cause these infections to occur as well. And how that works is by allowing your soil to overly dry out in between waterings. The small hair-like roots, the small water roots that grow off of the larger primary roots, those can dry out and die. And that's not only food for the decomposers, but where that root died and was attached to the healthy part of the plant, that's the wound. Just like if you were to be maybe repotting a plant and some of the roots get damaged, or you do a root pruning, those are all wounds. Just like on how we have skin, if we get a cut, that's an access point where we can get an infection. So underwatering and allowing the soil to completely dry out can not only damage those softer, more tender roots and provide an access point for those pathogens to get in, but also allowing your soil to dry out will reduce the numbers of the beneficial bacteria and funguses that are in the soil that we need to break down the organic materials to feed the plants. That's why in a lot of my videos you'll hear me say that what is actually meant by dry soil in between waterings is if you were to take a sponge and submerge it in the water, and then you take it out and you wring it out the best that you can, and you cannot get no more water out of the sponge, but the sponge is still moist, that's right around the level where you'd want to add some more water, because those roots need to remain moist, not saturated. You don't want there to be actual water sitting in the pot, which is why drainage is so important. Not only does the soil need to be able to drain out excess water, but it needs to be able to exit the pot. The pot itself needs to be able to drain away from the root structure. If you have a pot with drainage and you are setting it in a decorative pot that does not have drainage, well, even if you have well-draining soil, it's going to drain out of the soil, but then be laying in that pot where most likely there are some roots down there in between the two pots, and that's where the plant's going to start to rot because it doesn't have enough oxygen, because there's too much water. Now, I do want to mention things like cacti, succulents, even some of the tropical plants like snake plants, ZZ plants, orchids, they do not like to be in moist soil for prolonged periods of time. Their root structures developed in such a way that they're supposed to dry out completely. And as soon as they come in contact with moisture again, they real rapidly begin to suck and store that moisture. And then because of where they're naturally from, it's going to be extremely dry again for an extended amount of time. So there are exceptions, but for our tropical plants, a sponge that has been wrung out the best you can, but it's still moist, right around that amount of moisture is when the plant is ready to be rehydrated. If the soil dries out too much and those roots die, the plant also has to take energy and resources to regrow those roots before it can concentrate on the nice, beautiful foliage on top. Plus, it's now using these resources up that it could have used to help fight off a possible infection. There are a couple of ways that could at least indicate that the plant possibly does have an infection in the roots, and root rot is setting in. The thing is, though, what makes this a little difficult is what we're looking at are symptoms. Just like if we were to become ill with, let's say, food poisoning or the flu, two different sicknesses, but the symptoms are very similar. It's difficult really to diagnose a plant accurately sometimes. Now, with root rot, the plant can get yellow leaves if it's suffering from root rot, but it can also get yellow leaves for a variety of other reasons. Too much water, not enough water. Some of those leaves may just be aging out, or maybe they're shaded. There's lots of reasons, and it's totally natural for a plant to lose its leaves or to get yellow leaves. It's part of the natural life cycle. But if you're getting yellow leaves over a prolonged period of time and more than what you would normally expect, especially if it's happening to newer leaves, younger leaves, that could be a little more of an indicator of root rot. But if you notice this happening, now is a good time to lift that plant a little bit out of that pot and actually smell the soil. And if that soil smells foul, if it smells like methane or rotten eggs, something like that, then that is a real good indicator that root rot is taking hold. Now, if you can see the roots, that's an even better way to be able to indicate it. Healthy roots mostly will be white or a light beige, something like that. There are a few variety of plants that will have orange or red roots, but most of them will be like on the side of beige, maybe even a light brown. But a dark brown or black, that's pretty much a sure sign of root rot. Especially if you can see it, you should be able to smell it. Now you can actually touch the root. See if it's mushy. A root should not be mushy. Shouldn't fall apart or crumble. You shouldn't be able to squeeze it and moisture come out of it. If it is and the root's rotting, one thing that you can do is clean all of the soil off of the roots the best you can and discard that soil, because that soil has a large concentration of pathogens, and we don't want that in our house, because although we already obviously have these pathogens, we don't want even more spores being released, and we don't want to reuse this soil. So just get rid of it. And then use water to wash the rest of the roots off, not with a soap or a detergent or anything, just water, so that all you got left are the roots. Then you want to trim off those dead parts of the roots, not only up to the healthy part, but maybe a 1/4 inch or so, 1/2 inch maybe, if you have a lot of healthy root left. You want to get into that healthy part of the root because you want to get past the point of infection. Now, you're going to want to dip that into a solution that is 50% 3% hydrogen peroxide and water. equal parts of the two. You want hydrogen peroxide, which is at a 3%, and you want to mix that to an equal part of water. Submerge the roots into the water and give them a good swish around and let them sit in there for a good minute, maybe even 2 minutes, but I wouldn't do more than 2 minutes. And then take that root out and pot it up into fresh potting soil. But also, do not reuse that same pot until you disinfect that too. Maybe in the dishwasher, or use a light bleach solution, which could be as little as like a tablespoon to a cup or two of water, and just use that to really wash the pot good. Now, if we're talking about a terracotta pot, my recommendation would be to actually submerge that terracotta pot for a few hours at a minimum in a bleach solution. You know, maybe a cup of bleach, maybe it's a pot, you got to put it in a 5-gallon pail. So a cup of bleach into a 5-gallon pail of water, and then just submerge it, because that pot is so porous. You want that bleach solution to get into the pot to kill any potential spores that might be in there. And then let that pot completely dry out. You can then put fresh soil with your plant into that soil. Now, look at about how much of the root you have removed. If you've removed, let's say, 1/3 of those roots, or it's a real bad infestation and you had to remove 50% of the roots, that existing root structure still has to repair itself and support all that foliage above the soil line now. So if you whatever amount that you reduce off of the plant, you do want to try to reduce an equal amount of foliage off of the top of the plant. And let's say this is like some sort of vining plant or something that has nodes, like, you know, a lot of the pothos and philodendrons and monsteras, things like that. This is a great time to take a cutting of some of those nodes and restart a whole other plant. This way, if what you did to help the plant, it still doesn't make it, you still have backups. After you've repotted it, you've probably used some sort of a potting mix that has a slow release fertilizer in it already, or maybe it don't. Either way, you don't want to add any additional nutrients to the pot at this time. And that's because you want the root system, the root structure to start growing and filling out that pot. And it's actually going to do that quicker and develop its root system faster if it's in a situation where it's sending these roots out searching for nutrients. I know it sounds counterproductive, but if we add even additional fertilizer at this time, we have damaged roots, we have an unhealthy plant, and the additional fertilizers could actually burn the plant, weakening it even further compromising the immune system. We want to give our plants the best shot that they have at a full recovery. So before we finish up, I just want to show you how I make up my potting mixes. And I never use a topsoil. Topsoil will retain way too much water. It doesn't drain very well, even when you put additives into it. And when you get it really wet and then it dries, it can become hard and compacted, which is hard for the roots to grow through. You really want to stay with a potting mix that is composed of coco coir or peat moss. It will retain moisture, drain quite well, and even if it overly dries out, when you do rehydrate it, it won't be hard and compacted. So what I normally do, and this here is coco coir, what I'll normally do is take a pot that does have drainage. This pot does drain. It's got a hole in there and it will drain out. To be honest with you, I'm not really too happy with that hole. I would actually like more drainage. But this pot does drain. And what I'll normally do is I will fill a pot about 1/3 of the way up. And then I will add perlite. This is perlite right here. This is great because I'll mix this into the bottom third. It will prevent the soil from compacting, but it will allow it to dry out really easy and provide lots of little pockets for the oxygen to be. And then after I put some perlite in there, and I'm not too particular about the amounts, but I do use kind of a lot. I will also put some of this orchid bark in. This is wood bark right here. And this is great for aeration and drainage too. But also that bacteria we were talking about that feeds on the organic material. This will take a long time for the bacteria to be able to actually consume all of it and turn it into a usable compost. So I like to mix a little of that in pots that I know I won't be up-potting for a while. So I know that that beneficial bacteria is constantly creating some fresh compost in the pot. This is what it looks like. It's pretty much like 2 parts of the potting mix, which is peat moss or coco coir, 1 part perlite, and 1 part of the bark. And that's what I got at the bottom of the pot. I consider that my drainage layer. And we're going to be potting up a Baltic blue pothos. Baltic blue pothos. And this is what I was referring to before about having a pot that has drainage, but then you put it in a decorative pot that does not. Any water that drains out of this, it can't flow out of here, and these roots at the bottom will be sitting in there, and that's where root rot can get in. These roots all look just fine. Pack it down a little bit. And then I'll do a little bit of a top dressing over the top, which will be just the potting mix. And now this is just a personal preference for mine because the perlite will float, and I don't really like that look too much. So then I'll just put a little bit more of this over the top to keep the soil looking nice and dark. I just like that look more myself. So all of that perlite that we just put in there, that is going to really help the drainage as well as the aeration. And that wood bark is going to provide a long-term food source for the bacteria to continuously create compost right within the pot. And by me doing this, I don't really worry about root rot too much, even though I do water my plants nearly every day. But again, as I just showed you, I make sure I got good drainage, as well as drainage in the soil, but as well as in the pot. Now I want to show you one more thing. If, when I had potted up this plant, I had damaged some of the roots, what I would be doing now is putting in some cinnamon. This is just cinnamon, it's a spice. And this is actually good at killing off some of the pathogens in the soil. But it also acts as a rooting powder. Now, the thing about rooting powder is it actually doesn't promote the growth of roots. What rooting powder does is it stimulates the immune system in a plant. So when you make a cutting and you dip that plant into some rooting powder, you're not actually doing anything to stimulate root growth. You're stimulating the immune system because there's a wound where you made the cutting, and now that has activated that immune system in the plant to have it already active just in case any problems happen. I'm just going to put a real little bit of this in here. I do this usually when I up pot or do it, especially if I'm doing any kind of root pruning or I see damaged roots or anything like that. The reason I just put this in there is just for a little extra protection because I've just up potted in winter, and I am going to put another video together all about how and when and why it's appropriate and safe to up pot in the winter. Be one of my upcoming videos here pretty soon. But I just showed you how I make my potting soil, and this has really good drainage. And even though I do water almost every day, I really don't have to worry about root rot. And there's plenty of space in here for the plant to start to grow out and stuff. And it should be a nice, happy, healthy plant.